first of all, to define it, the actual job of reporting is no different. But I do think that there are some significantly different avenues of information that we can provide to our readers that you can't do in traditional newspaper. In a traditional newspaper, you're limited to X number of inches per column and whatnot because of advertising space. But online, we can not only put up a story of whatever length we want, but we can also link to significant information such as documents that support it, court documents, police reports. You can also put up, the audio from an interview. Which helps people to find out what's really going on in the depth of that conversation. Because in a good interview, you have a back and forth with your subject. And, while you're going to go out and pull out one or two pieces, quotes to use in your story, I think it's important to be able to give people an opportunity to hear it in the full context and hear the full conversation. Because a lot of times what I think may be interesting may not be what's interesting to my readers who find something else that's important. So I think there's a way to provide more depth of information in the internet than there is in standard standard news outlets.
Now, you used to do just text, and now you've had to pick up video skills. Where did you learn those, and how would you rate yourself as a videographer these days? What kinds of things? How is video for the web different?
I picked up video as a result of doing what I'm doing. Just needed to be able to have that as an extra tool in my pocket. And frankly, I'm not very good at video at all. I just am not. Video is a whole different genre than writing or even still photography, which I think I've actually gotten very good at, which, again, that's all self-taught. Sound slides or Win Movie Maker, which I've used before as well, are both awesome tools to not only take audio but marry it with images, and I do that on an occasional basis with some really great photos and that sort of stuff. So I feel more comfortable in still than I do with video, but I certainly can do video. I've got a little high definition video camera that shoots about 2 hours on its battery and shoots it on an SD card so I can pull it out, and it comes with its own editing suite, so I can edit it as I need to, and then it automatically uploads to YouTube.
And a lot of the video that you shoot, however, I'm not sure that for the web, we're going for fast and quick, and I just want to see it. It doesn't have to be artistic. It doesn't have to be organized, composed shots for everything.
Well, I think that's true, but I also think that there's it's got to still tell a story. And for instance, some of the video that we'll be putting up in a story that I'm working on about the March 16th protests, the video kind of misses some of the action because I was trying to get all of the action at one time. That kind of defeats the purpose of what you're doing. So it looks very amateur, and I fully admit that. So I'm not a videographer. Never claimed to be.
What are some of the favorite stories that you've done, the ones that you've really enjoyed working on, and why have they been satisfying?
Well, I think all of the HIV criminalization stories that I've worked on have been particularly satisfying for a multiple level of reasons. First of all, nobody else is reporting on it. And I think that there's a great injustice that's going on there. So being able to highlight that and talk about those issues, I think, is really important. We've also had some real impacts from that. We've had government agencies actually change their behavior as a result of our reporting. And ultimately, we all, as reporters, we all live by the adage of, comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And that's, I think, a perfect example of that. I think the other one that I'm particularly proud of is the MSU basketball rape case story. Not because it was this big hoo-ha thing, but because it was an important story that needed to be told in terms of what does sexual assault look like. And I think our comments and the pickup from that, I think, went very far in proving that people wanted to talk about the issue and didn't understand what sexual assault is. There's this concept that when somebody consents, they can't revoke consent. And so we saw a lot of that. We saw a lot of victim blaming. And I think that helped tell a better story and present information that people may not understand in the beginning. And so, when the prosecutor's office said, there was no crime committed, and we went further and asked people to weigh into it, that helped teach people what really goes into looking at a criminal behavior. And we had a defense attorney, a former prosecutor, and a sexual assault person who reviewed all the documents, and the defense attorney, which was a surprise to us, said absolutely there's enough for charges here. The sexual assault person said the same thing, and the prosecutor said I'd want more information before I'd make a decision. So clearly there's a lot more there than what was being allowed, and I think that helped feed a conversation that happened, I think, throughout the entire school year at MSU.
These are more complex stories than the traditional media covers, or at least you cover them in a more complex way. You think online media has the opportunity to go more in depth to follow stories that might be a 1 or 2 paragraph one-day headline for another publication?
Oh, absolutely. And I think because we're online, we have the ability to go, again, the depth of news. We're able to go to people who can talk about it in a theoretical context, which helps to frame what's really happening. During the presidential campaign, when Obama was being accused of palling around with terrorists and people were screaming, "Kill him," and that sort of stuff, we went to Jeffrey Feldman, who runs the Frame Shop in New York City and is a professor at NYU, and asked him, what does this mean? What does this kind of language really talk about? Which got us much deeper into the conversation that really, I think, was framed by the McCain campaign in terms of people's discomfort with race in America still. So there's a fantastic conversation there that the mainstream media didn't have the space, the time, or the inclination to delve into.
You also cover HIV issues, and when we talk about diversity in reporting and things that many traditional local media can't do, it seems that these sort of niche stories, there's a specific audience for this that is intensely interested in the issue, and then there's a sort of mainstream audience for whom that's a whole totally different world they're not familiar with. How do you bridge that gap to make, when you write a report on HIV issues, who's your audience? People who are intensely interested because of a personal connection to the issue, or are you trying to educate a broader audience, or both?
I think it's both, and I think, when I write the pieces, I'm really targeting the policymakers, because that's really who our audience is. So we're really informing those policymakers about what's really going on with this. I think HIV, there's a lot of room for it to be covered in the mainstream media. I think the mainstream media, like the rest of America, has sort of forgotten about the epidemic. And I think that's part of the reason why my reporting is so strong, is that it's the only stuff out there, which I think in many ways actually troubles me. Because we are still seeing 50,000 or more new infections every year, which is on par with what it was at in the early days of the epidemic. And some studies that have been done show that it's the level of infection or understanding of the infection is the same as it was in 1987. So that same level of understanding about how the virus is spread. That's obviously the media's fault. Every time the media does a criminalization story about, this person's being charged because he bit somebody and he's HIV positive, the HIV is terrorist case, perfect example, that increases the perception that biting spreads HIV, or spit does, and it doesn't. And yet the mainstream media didn't put that information out there. They would just say, he's been charged with, threatening this or challenging or possibly transmitting the virus this way. And they don't go beyond that and say, well, what does the CDC say? Well, the CDC says there's 1 case out of 1 million identified cases that they have targeted as spreading through bite, and it turns out that it was a case of a prostitute biting one of her clients after he refused to pay her for sex. So it's not even that strong of a case for biting.
One of the challenges, I think, with doing those stories is that you have to be, I think, a champion in addition to being a journalist. And I think that's uncomfortable for a lot of traditional media to do, because you're taking an underserved population and you're telling it from their point of view. So often what we see in the mainstream media is exactly that. The prosecutor says we're going to arrest this person for biting, and that's the end of the story.
Yeah, I think that's part of it, but I also think that it's not necessarily taking it from somebody's point of view. I think there's a reality here that I have an obligation to tell the whole story. And the whole story is that if somebody who's HIV positive bites somebody, they're not going to spread the virus. There's not a crime committed there. And yet, we still present it as such. And so I think the mainstream media can learn more from that.
One thing that the web does is it allows people to cover, I mean, you can cover HIV issues. Does it matter that you yourself are HIV positive? Does that give you a burning passion to do those stories? Is that how that happened, or?
You know, no. For a long time, I didn't want to do HIV stories, but I think that as I began looking at criminalization, and I really think the HIV as terrorism case that we started covering back in 2009 really drove my push to get into more about criminalization. I really realized that there was some really inappropriate stuff happening from the government. And so that's really what drove me. It's not that I'm HIV positive that's driving me, it's my sense of social justice that drives me. And I think too often as reporters we keep getting this crappy idea that we have to be objective. Well, the very nature of our language is not objective, it's a subjective choice. What verb you use in your lead is a subjective option, and it betrays, in some ways, your own views. So I think that we have to start talking in J schools about that. We have to start saying, look, the only thing you can really do is be fair, which means you're telling both sides and you're presenting all the information. Unfortunately, because the prosecutor says we're going to arrest him for biting and that could spread HIV, nobody goes beyond that. And that's the problem. That's not all the information.
Finding the right sources. One of the things that your own personal situation may do is give you more contacts with people you know you can tap into, and that you are perhaps more able to approach them. Would that help?
I think it helped in telling the story of Michael Holder, who has actually spent 8 years in a Michigan prison for failing to disclose to his girlfriend. And it also helped to get Noah, who that was a pseudonym that we used, who was facing criminal charges because the Michigan State Police disclosed his HIV status to his girlfriend in violation of state law. I think that my being HIV positive helped them feel comfortable in telling their stories to me. But I've also had people who are not HIV positive who feel comfortable telling their stories to me about the risk behavior that they're taking and that sort of stuff. So I think in some ways yes, but in other ways no. I mean, we all develop resources regardless of our personal identities, and that's how you work sources. I mean, everywhere I go, I pull sources so that I have all these sources all over the country that can answer questions in a variety of different issues, whether it's foreclosure crisis or HIV or it's criminalization or, I mean, you have sources for all those issues, and that helps, again, to get beyond the headline and into the meat of the story and provide our readers with the depth of what's going on.
What advice would you give to young reporters about making sure that they don't just settle for this sort of surface gloss, one quote from this side, one quote from someone else, throw an expert in for a 6-second quote here, and then that's the end of the story?
My favorite thing is to ask why. And I always ask why. It drives some of my sources crazy. But I think why gets you to places that you would never think to get yourself. The other question is to question more in depth your sources about whatever you're covering. Really get beyond just their spin. And I've been known to say to people, you know, that's great spin, but that's not answering my question. Here's the question again, now answer it. It's okay to call them out on that, I think. And too many times I see journalists who are afraid to say, look, you're spinning this, cut it out. And that allows the spin to keep going, which really doesn't serve any of us, whether it's our readers or us, in telling the story and presenting the truth.
I've seen a sort of PRification of the culture where everybody has a PR person now to explain their story, and many of them have been trained in J school, so they know what the 6-second soundbite is all about. So breaking through that is just a matter of being relentless in pursuing them and also having the time. Some of the thing I worry about when you see some of your peers, they do dash from, they have to do 5 stories a day. Well,
we do the same thing at Michigan Messenger. I mean, I'll be doing, at any given time, I'll have between 3 and 6 investigative pieces up in the air. And I'll be doing, interviewing sources on it, getting documents and all that sort of stuff. That's a lot of work. But there's a commitment that you have to have. Unfortunately, I think the corporatization of the media is the bigger issue because, the corporate entities, Gannett and whatnot, you get 40 hours and that's all you get. And I think, the oil spill situation in Battle Creek last summer was a perfect example. There's no excuse for me as the guy from outside the community to come in and get a copy of the initial fire report before the Battle Creek did. for me to go in and find undocumented workers being exploited and exposed to chemicals. There's no excuse for me to have been able to do that over the Battle Creek Enquirer. They should have had those resources well beyond anything that I had, and yet we beat them to the punch on those because they were limited in the amount of time they could report.
What is your day like? Because it is different. You don't punch in at an office. You don't spend a lot of time around the water cooler with the other people.
No, the water cooler is cyber, just like our space is. I mean, we do chat by GChat and that sort of stuff, and we also have an email listserv, so we can update each other about what's going on and what stories we have happening, and ask each other, what sources do you have for this story, which is really helpful. But my day starts, in the morning. I get up and I read between 20 and 25 newspapers. Really, I scan most of the headlines, and I've gotten to a point now where I know what I need to look at. So I can click into a story, look at it, and then I can pull a blog where I can start making calls about something and say, wow, this is going to be a story. I also then, check my emails, and I'll have anywhere between 100 and 300 emails every morning when I wake up. And I usually go to bed at like 1 or 2 in the morning, and get up about 8, 9. So to have that many emails come through in the middle of the night is a big deal. And then I start making calls and working on the stories that I'm investigating on.
So it's really a lifestyle job. It's not like an office 8 to 5 at all.
No, absolutely not. And I think part of what makes me so successful is that I do put in 12, 14, 16-hour days, which most mainstream media outlets are not going to let you do. Because they don't want to be accused of exploiting you. And I understand that, but you know what? If it takes 12 hours or 14 hours or 16 hours to get the work done and right, then that's what I'm going to take, and that's what I do. And I think all of us at Michigan Messenger and in the American Independent News Network are really committed to telling the story as truthfully as possible, as well as bringing as much information to the forefront as possible to inform our readers about what that story really means in a larger cultural context. Unfortunately, again, I don't think we see that in the mainstream media right now. It's frustrating. We do see it, interestingly enough, though, in the right-wing echo chamber. They create their memes and they echo it out with their supporting information, and everybody says the same thing. The progressive movement has not been able to do the same thing, so it's really interesting to watch the interplay between the two.
And a lot of local news is community news. It's the car crash on the corner. It's the fire down the street. Those aren't the kinds of stories that interest Michigan Messenger. And so what are the kinds of news stories? What does the story have to have for you to cover?
Michigan Messenger is looking for policy stories. So if that car accident brought up some serious policy concerns within a municipality or the state, that would be a story for us. But the fact that there was a car accident is not a story. Going back to the sexual assault case, just because there was a sexual assault involving 2 high-profile basketball players does not make it a news story for us. What made it a news story for us was that the prosecutor had declined to prosecute. That made it a news story. Why did he decline to prosecute? Was there something inappropriate about it? What really happened? And that, I think, is sort of the way we look at everything. It's what is the policy implication here, and how do we get to that policy conversation?
One of the tools you rely on heavily is the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, and you recently testified down at the Michigan House of Representatives about that in front of a committee looking at problems journalists have been facing with the law in Michigan. What are your concerns about that right now?
Well, they're myriad. But I think probably the biggest issue right now is that we are still seeing different public bodies overcharging, at least in my opinion, for access to documents. The law allows them to get covered basic expenses. But there's also in that law a clause called the public interest clause. And it says that if the public body determines it's in the public interest to release it, there won't be a cost. Well, the public body never wants to admit that something that's a scandal is in the public interest to know. And the Michigan State University basketball case is a perfect example of that. MSU did not want us to know what these 2 basketball players were accused of doing. And we pushed it. I mean, we ended up having to file 2 major appeals with MSU in order to get documents that had already been unredacted by the county prosecutor. But it was a principal issue. The other thing that I think is a real concern is that there are so many loopholes now and so many attorney general opinions that you can find a way to deny access to information or give access to information using any of those loopholes. So I think there needs to be some clarification. The third thing is the appeals court ruled last summer that emails and other electronic forms of communications may not be covered by freedom of information, and I really think the legislature needs to address that. And finally, the other concern I have is that FOIA does not cover the legislature or the governor's office. And what I told that committee was, if you really want to lead on this issue, the first thing you need to do is lead on this issue and extend this to cover the legislature and the governor's office. And there seemed to have been some interest in that from the committee. So I think we may see some real transparency movement here in the state in the next year.
Other states do allow it.
Yes.
That's how Sarah Palin had a lot of her emails, for example, given over to reporters, and they built interesting stories around that. So we're probably missing quite a bit.
I think we are. I mean, Dennis Muchmore, who is the chief of staff for Governor Schneider, said that he would let people in who had something important to say, to meet with him. Well, we can't get his calendar to know who he's been meeting with. So we don't know who they think has important information. And I think that's an important piece of information for the public to understand, particularly as we're getting ready to pass this big budget today.
Closing piece of advice to young journalists looking at launching a career. What should they do while they're in college? How should they get that first job? What should they aim for?
One, start a blog. Start using your own writing skills and what you're learning in the J School to start exercising. Because the more you write, the more journalistic stuff you do, the more you're going to get better at it, which is going to help you in the long run in getting a job. Secondly, every chance you have to write in a professional place, whether it's Lansing Online News, whether it's the state news, whether it's freelancing for the state journal, get it, take it, use it. Those are incredibly important stepping stones towards a career. Thirdly, don't narrow yourself to traditional media outlets. Look at the online news networks. You can start your own. Citizen journalism is a big deal right now, and I think in many ways an equalizer of what's happening in terms of the echo chambers and the mainstream media, which does not pick and choose well, in my opinion, what's newsworthy. I really don't care what J-Lo was wearing last night. I don't think that's news. I do, however, think that if the president is in Ireland and people are attacking him for it, that is news. However, it didn't get covered that way. So I do think that there are some ways that you can learn more by using online sources.